October 17, 2023. The West Bottoms district of Kansas City, Missouri, where the Kansas and Missouri rivers converge in a lowland that had once been the industrial heart of the American Midwest. A demolition crew had been working for 3 weeks on the systematic dismantling of the former Consolidated Storage and Transfer Company warehouse, a 6-story brick structure that had stood at the corner of Hickory and 12th Street since 1923. The building had been vacant for nearly 4 decades, its windows boarded, its interior a maze of collapsed floors and accumulated debris that made comprehensive surveying impossible. The city had condemned the structure in 2019, but legal disputes over ownership had delayed demolition until the previous summer. Now, with interior stripping nearly complete, the crew had reached the building's basement level, a cavernous space that extended beneath the entire footprint of the structure and descended 2 additional levels into the earth. Foreman Robert Delgado noticed the anomaly at approximately 2:15 p.m. during a routine inspection of the sub-basement's northwest quadrant. The area had been walled off from the rest of the underground space, sealed behind a brick partition that did not appear on any of the original architectural drawings the demolition company had obtained from city records. The partition was approximately 12 feet wide and extended from floor to ceiling, its brickwork slightly different in color and texture from the surrounding walls, suggesting construction at a later date. Delgado initially assumed the sealed section contained old mechanical equipment or perhaps hazardous materials that previous owners had preferred to entomb rather than properly dispose of. He ordered his crew to proceed carefully with the wall's removal, documenting their progress with photographs as required by the company's discovery protocols. The first breach in the brick partition revealed not machinery or storage containers, but empty darkness that seemed to extend considerably beyond the wall. Workers enlarged the opening with pneumatic hammers, creating a gap approximately 4 feet wide through which flashlight beams could penetrate. What those beams illuminated caused Delgado to immediately halt all work and order his crew to evacuate the immediate area. Behind the partition lay a hidden chamber approximately 40 feet long and 30 feet wide, its concrete floor covered with decades of accumulated dust and debris. In the center of this concealed space, preserved in the absolute darkness that had shielded it for more than 6 decades, sat an automobile. The vehicle was a 1960 Chevrolet Impala Sport Coupe, its distinctive tail fins and chrome trim still recognizable beneath layers of dust and cobwebs that had accumulated during its long concealment. The Impala had been positioned carefully within the chamber, its nose facing the sealed entrance, as if the driver had intended to depart at some future date that never arrived. The vehicle's windows were rolled up, its doors closed, its tires long since deflated and cracked from decades without movement or maintenance. The original color appeared to have been tuxedo black, though the dust made definitive assessment impossible from a distance. Delgado approached the vehicle cautiously, his flashlight beam playing across the interior through the driver's side window. The front seat was empty, but the beam revealed shapes in the back seat that did not belong to the vehicle's original equipment. He moved closer, wiping a section of glass with his gloved hand to improve visibility. What he saw in the back seat caused him to stumble backward, nearly falling in his haste to retreat from the vehicle. The shapes were human remains, skeletal now after more than 60 years in the sealed chamber, draped in deteriorated fabric that had once been clothing. There appeared to be a single individual, positioned in the back seat as if sleeping, head tilted against the doorframe at an angle that suggested violence rather than rest. Delgado immediately called 911, his voice shaking as he reported the discovery to the dispatcher. Within 30 minutes, Kansas City Police Department patrol units had secured the demolition site, and detectives from the Major Case Squad were en route to what had suddenly become one of the most significant crime scene discoveries in the city's history. The warehouse that had concealed its secret for 63 years was about to surrender the truth. The crime scene investigation proceeded with extraordinary care, given the age and fragility of the evidence. Forensic technicians documented every aspect of the sealed chamber before any attempt was made to access the vehicle or its contents. The brick partition was analyzed and determined to have been constructed using materials and techniques consistent with the late 1950s or early 1960 seconds, suggesting the chamber had been sealed shortly after the vehicle's placement. The chamber itself appeared to have been an original feature of the warehouse, possibly intended for cold storage or secure document keeping, though its existence had been concealed from subsequent owners by the removal of relevant pages from architectural records. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure this space would remain undiscovered. The 1960 Chevrolet Impala was photographed from every angle before technicians opened the driver's door for the first time since its concealment. The interior smelled of dust and decay, the leather seats cracked and brittle, the dashboard instruments frozen at readings that would never change. The odometer showed 23,847 miles, suggesting the vehicle had been relatively new when it entered this tomb. The keys remained in the ignition, turned to the off position. Personal effects scattered throughout the interior included a leather wallet, a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, a gold lighter engraved with initials, and approximately $300 in cash that had remained untouched for more than 6 decades. The license plates had been removed, their absence suggesting deliberate effort to complicate identification. The human remains were carefully extracted from the back seat and transported to the Jackson County Medical Examiner's Office for examination. Patricia Okonkwo, the chief medical examiner, recognized immediately that the case would require extensive forensic analysis to establish both identity and cause of death. The skeleton was that of an adult male, approximately 5 feet 10 inches in height, between 40 and 50 years of age at the time of death, based on skeletal indicators. The skull showed massive trauma to the posterior region, consistent with multiple blows from a heavy object or possibly gunshot wounds that had destroyed significant portions of bone. Dental work present in the remains suggested professional dental care during the subject's lifetime, potentially providing a pathway to identification if records could be located. The vehicle identification number, stamped into the Impala's dashboard and door frame, provided the first concrete lead in establishing when and to whom the car had been sold. Records from the Missouri Department of Revenue, cross-referenced with archived dealer documentation, revealed that this specific 1960 Chevrolet Impala Sport Coupe had been purchased new in September 1960 from Munganast Chevrolet in St. Louis. The buyer was listed as Salvatore Michael Marcello, with an address in Kansas City, Missouri. The name immediately triggered recognition among law enforcement officials familiar with the history of organized crime in the region. Salvatore Marcello had been a prominent figure in the Kansas City underworld during the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, an associate of the Savella crime family who had vanished without explanation in December 1960. The FBI was notified of the discovery within hours, as the Marcello disappearance had been the subject of federal investigation during the early 1960 seconds. Agents from the Kansas City field office arrived to coordinate with local authorities and review historical files that had been archived for more than 50 years. The Marcello case had never been officially closed, remaining in the Bureau's records as an unsolved suspected homicide with connections to organized crime activity in the Midwest. Now, with the apparent discovery of both Marcello and his vehicle, investigators had an opportunity to answer questions that had lingered since the Kennedy administration occupied the White House. The warehouse, where the Impala was discovered, had a history that intersected significantly with Kansas City's organized crime operations during the mid-20th century. The Consolidated Storage and Transfer Company had been one of several businesses in the West Bottoms district that operated under the protection of the Savella organization, paying tribute for the privilege of conducting operations without interference. The building had served as a distribution point for various goods, both legal and otherwise, taking advantage of its proximity to rail lines and river transportation. By the 1980 seconds, changing economics and shifting transportation patterns had rendered such facilities obsolete, and the warehouse had been abandoned to decades of neglect. The discovery prompted renewed investigation into the circumstances of Marcello's disappearance and his role within the Kansas City criminal hierarchy during the turbulent period of the late 1950 seconds and early 1,960 seconds. FBI files from that era revealed a complex picture of a man who had risen from street-level enforcement to positions of significant responsibility within the organization. Marcello had been suspected of involvement in multiple criminal enterprises, including gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering, though no charges had ever been successfully prosecuted due to witness intimidation and lack of physical evidence. His sudden disappearance in December 1960 had been noted by federal surveillance teams but never adequately explained. The condition of the sealed chamber and the vehicle it contained suggested a sophisticated disposal operation that would have required significant resources and planning. The brick partition had been constructed with professional precision, its mortar properly mixed and applied, its courses level and true. Someone with construction expertise had sealed this tomb, working in the darkness of the sub-basement to ensure no evidence of the concealed space would be visible to casual inspection. The work had been thorough enough to deceive everyone who had entered the warehouse over the subsequent 6 decades, a testament to both the skill of the builders and the luck that had preserved their secret. Historical research into the Consolidated Storage and Transfer Company revealed that the business had been owned during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds by a consortium of investors whose names appeared repeatedly in FBI files on Kansas City organized crime. The company had provided legitimate cover for various illegal activities while generating sufficient, honest revenue to withstand scrutiny from tax authorities. By 1975, the original ownership group had died or relocated, and the property had passed through several hands before being acquired by a development company that had planned renovation but never secured financing. The building's criminal history had been largely forgotten by the time the city condemned it nearly 50 years later. As news of the discovery spread through media outlets, historians and journalists began reconstructing the story of Salvatore Marcello and his place in the criminal hierarchy of 1,960 seconds Kansas City. The period had been one of transition for organized crime in the region, with the Savella family consolidating power following the upheavals of the previous decade. Nick Savella had assumed control of the Kansas City organization in 1953, following the assassination of his predecessor, and had spent the subsequent years building relationships with crime families in other cities while tightening his grip on local operations. Marcello had been one of his trusted lieutenants, handling assignments that required discretion and a willingness to use violence when circumstances demanded. The investigation revealed that December 1960 had been a particularly tense period for the Kansas City organization. Nick Chavella and his brother Carl had just been named to Nevada's infamous Black Book, officially banning them from entering any casino in the state. This designation represented a significant threat to the organization's expanding interests in Las Vegas gambling, interests that would eventually grow to include substantial skimming operations at major casinos. Anyone who might have been perceived as a liability during this sensitive period would have been in considerable danger, and Salvatore Marcello had apparently fallen into that category for reasons that remained unclear even after 6 decades. Before we continue with this investigation, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in Kansas City in December 1960 involves the inner workings of one of America's most disciplined crime families, a trusted lieutenant who became a liability, and a disappearance that remained unsolved for 63 years until a demolition crew broke through a hidden wall. The 1,960 Chevrolet Impala found in that sealed chamber was more than a vintage automobile. It was a time capsule of murder, preserved in absolute darkness while the world above changed beyond recognition. By the end of this story, you will understand how Salvatore Marcello rose through the ranks of the Kansas City underworld, why he became expendable to the men who had employed him, and how his body remained hidden mere blocks from the city's police headquarters for more than 6 decades. Salvatore Michael Marcello was 43 years old in December 1960, a barrel-chested man who stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed approximately 210 pounds of muscle that was just beginning to soften with age and comfortable living. His hair was black, graying at the temples, worn in the short, conservative style favored by businessmen of his era. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, described by those who knew him as capable of shifting from jovial warmth to cold calculation within moments. He favored well-tailored suits in dark colors, crisp white shirts, and narrow silk ties that reflected his position as a man of substance within the Kansas City Italian-American community. The 1960 Chevrolet Impala he drove tuxedo black with a red interior and a 348 cubic inch V8 engine, announced his status without excessive ostentation. Marcello had been born on June 12, 1917, in the North End neighborhood of Kansas City, Missouri, the second of 4 children in a family that had emigrated from Sicily in 1905. His father, Giuseppe Marcello, had worked in the meatpacking plants that dominated the West Bottoms, earning modest wages that supported his family but offered no path to prosperity. Young Salvatore had grown up in the shadow of the stockyards, surrounded by the sounds and smells of an industry that employed thousands of immigrants in work that was dangerous, exhausting, and poorly compensated. He had learned early that legitimate labor offered survival, but never success, and that other paths existed for those willing to take risks and accept the consequences. By age 16, Marcello had dropped out of school and begun running errands for older men whose activities existed outside the boundaries of legitimate commerce. He collected payments from gambling operations, delivered messages that could not be trusted to telephones, and demonstrated a talent for violence that attracted the attention of those who controlled the organization. His first arrest came at age 18 for assault on a man who had failed to honor a gambling debt. The charges were dropped when the victim declined to testify, a pattern that would repeat throughout Marcello's criminal career. He learned that witnesses could be persuaded, that evidence could disappear, and that loyalty was the currency that mattered most in his chosen profession. The late 1930 seconds and 1940 seconds saw Marcello rise steadily through the ranks of the Kansas City underworld, surviving internal conflicts that eliminated less capable or less loyal competitors. He served in the Army during World War II, spending 2 years in Europe before receiving a medical discharge for injuries sustained in combat. The military experience had taught him discipline and organization, skills he applied effectively upon his return to Kansas City and the resumption of his criminal career. By 1950, he had become one of the most reliable enforcers in the organization, trusted with assignments that required both physical capability and discretion about their completion. In 1948, Marcello married Angela Fontana, the daughter of a legitimate businessman who operated a grocery store in the Italian neighborhood where both families had roots. Angela was 22 years old, devoutly Catholic, and apparently unaware of the specific nature of her husband's occupation beyond its connection to undefined business interests. Their wedding, at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church, was attended by over 300 guests, including men whose presence would later be documented in FBI surveillance photographs. The reception at a hall on Independence Avenue featured music, dancing, and toasts that celebrated the union of 2 respected families within the community. The Marcello household established itself at 3847 Campbell Street in a comfortable 2-story home that Angela decorated with religious artwork and photographs of extended family. Salvatore and Angela had 3 children during the 1950 seconds. Michael, born 1949, Rosa, born 1952, and Vincent, born 1955. Marcello proved to be an attentive father when his work permitted, attending his children's school events and religious celebrations, maintaining the appearance of a respectable family man whose business interests required frequent evening meetings and occasional travel. Angela managed the household finances, though the source of the money that funded their comfortable lifestyle was never discussed in specific terms. By 1958, Marcello had risen to a position of considerable influence within the Savella organization, serving as one of Nick Savella's most trusted lieutenants. His responsibilities included oversight of gambling operations in several Kansas City neighborhoods, collection of tribute from businesses operating under the organization's protection, and occasional assignments that required the skills he had developed during his years as an enforcer. He was known within the organization as Sally the Builder, a reference to his ability to construct solutions to problems that others found insurmountable. The nickname also reflected his legitimate business interests in construction, interests that provided both income and cover for his criminal activities. Marcello's construction company, Heartland Building Services, operated from an office on Main Street and employed approximately 30 workers who handled residential and commercial projects throughout the Kansas City metropolitan area. The company had contracts with several legitimate developers and maintained a reputation for quality work delivered on schedule. It also served as a mechanism for money laundering, absorbing cash from illegal operations into a revenue stream that could be reported to tax authorities without raising suspicion. The dual nature of the business required careful management, but Marcello proved adept at maintaining the separation between his legitimate and criminal enterprises. The relationship between Marcello and Nick Savella had developed over more than 2 decades, built on demonstrated loyalty and consistent performance of assigned tasks. Savella trusted Marcello with sensitive assignments that required absolute discretion, including the handling of problems that arose with other members of the organization. This trust brought increased responsibility and increased earnings, but it also brought increased danger. Men who knew too much about the organization's operations became potential liabilities if circumstances changed, and Marcello had accumulated considerable knowledge during his years of service. He understood this dynamic and believed his continued usefulness would protect him from the fate that befell those who became expendable. By late 1960, however, circumstances within the organization were shifting in ways that would prove fatal for Salvatore Marcello. The addition of Nick Savella and his brother to Nevada's Black Book had intensified federal scrutiny of the Kansas City family's operations, making every aspect of the organization's activities subject to enhanced surveillance. Informants were being cultivated, wiretaps were being installed, and pressure was being applied to anyone who might be persuaded to cooperate with federal investigators. In this environment, men who had previously been assets could quickly become liabilities if their loyalty was questioned or their exposure to prosecution made cooperation attractive. The specific events that led to Marcello's death remained unclear even after 6 decades of investigation, but FBI files from the period suggested several possible scenarios. One theory proposed that Marcello had been suspected of providing information to federal agents, a betrayal that would have warranted immediate and severe punishment regardless of his previous service. Another theory suggested that Marcello had been skimming from gambling operations he supervised, diverting funds that should have been passed up the organizational hierarchy. A third theory proposed that Marcello knew too much about certain activities and had become a potential witness whose elimination was deemed necessary for the organization's protection. The last confirmed sighting of Salvatore Marcello alive occurred on December 14, 1960, at approximately 6:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. He was observed by FBI surveillance agents leaving his construction company office on Main Street and entering his 1960 Chevrolet Impala. The agents noted his departure but did not follow, as their assignment was to document visitors to the building rather than to track Marcello's movements. His wife Angela later told investigators that he had called her at approximately 7 p.m. to say he would be attending a meeting and might be late returning home. She never heard from him again, and when he failed to appear by the following morning, she began making calls to associates who professed no knowledge of his whereabouts. Angela Marcello filed a missing persons report with the Kansas City Police Department on December 16, 1960, 2 days after her husband's disappearance. The report was taken but generated minimal investigative activity, as police officials recognized Marcello's name and suspected that his absence was connected to his criminal associations. Federal agents were more interested, viewing the disappearance as potentially significant for their ongoing investigation of the Savella organization. But without a body or evidence of foul play, there was little they could do beyond documenting the fact that another figure connected to Kansas City organized crime had vanished without explanation. Within the organization itself, Marcello's disappearance was met with studied silence that spoke volumes to those who understood its meaning. His gambling operations were absorbed by other members, his construction contracts transferred to different management, his responsibilities distributed among survivors who asked no questions about his fate. The seamless transition suggested that his elimination had been planned in advance, with arrangements made for succession before the event occurred. Anyone who might have been tempted to inquire about Marcelo's whereabouts understood that such curiosity would be interpreted as disloyalty, and disloyalty had consequences that had just been demonstrated. The years following Marcello's disappearance saw the Sevilla organization continue its expansion, particularly in Las Vegas, where skimming operations at major casinos would eventually generate millions of dollars in unreported income. Nick Sevilla attended the infamous Appalachian meeting of mob bosses in 1957 and emerged as a figure of national significance within organized crime circles. The Kansas City family maintained a low profile compared to more flamboyant organizations in other cities, preferring quiet efficiency to public notoriety. This approach served them well for decades, allowing operations to continue with minimal interference from law enforcement despite ongoing federal investigation. Angela Marcello maintained hope for her husband's return for several years, though that hope gradually transformed into resigned acceptance of his probable death. She never remarried, raising their 3 children alone while maintaining the Highland Park home until financial necessity forced its sale in 1968. The family relocated to a smaller house in the Brookside neighborhood, where Angela lived until her death from cancer in 1991. She had never received definitive word about her husband's fate, going to her grave with questions that would not be answered for another 3 decades. Her children inherited both her uncertainty and her determination to eventually learn the truth. Michael, the eldest son, became a lawyer and moved to Chicago, deliberately distancing himself from his father's legacy and the city where that legacy cast such a long shadow. Rosa married a businessman and settled in suburban Kansas City, raising 4 children while avoiding any discussion of her father's criminal associations. Vincent, the youngest, struggled with alcohol and drug addiction throughout his 20s and 30s, never fully escaping the trauma of his father's disappearance and the family's subsequent decline. All 3 children were still living when their father's remains were finally discovered, though Vincent would die just months after the identification was confirmed. The warehouse that concealed Marcelo's body continued operating as a storage facility until 1985, when changing transportation patterns and the decline of the meatpacking industry rendered such operations economically unviable. The building was sold to a development company that intended to convert it to loft apartments, capitalizing on the industrial aesthetic that was becoming fashionable in urban renovation. But financing challenges and legal disputes among the partners delayed the project indefinitely, and the warehouse sat empty while its condition deteriorated. No one who entered the building during those years had any reason to suspect that a hidden chamber existed beneath the sub-basement floor, or that a man had been waiting there since 1960 for someone to find him. The sealed chamber where Marcelo's Impala rested had been constructed with materials and methods that explained its successful concealment for more than 6 decades. The brick partition matched the surrounding walls closely enough to appear original to casual inspection, and the removal of relevant architectural drawings had eliminated any documentary evidence of the hidden space. The chamber's ventilation had been sealed, creating an anaerobic environment that slowed decomposition and prevented the escape of odors that might have attracted attention. Someone with detailed knowledge of the building's construction had designed this tomb, and someone with access to city records had ensured its existence would not be discovered through routine examination. By the 1992, the West Bottoms district had become a curiosity rather than an industrial center, its massive brick warehouses either abandoned or converted to antique malls and entertainment venues that attracted weekend visitors. The neighborhood's history as the center of Kansas City's meatpacking industry had faded from living memory, replaced by a reputation for atmospheric architecture and occasional flooding when the rivers exceeded their banks. Developers occasionally announced plans for major investment that never materialized, and the area remained suspended between decay and renewal. The condemned warehouse at Hickory and 12th sat waiting, its secret intact. As the new millennium arrived, the forensic examination of Marcello's remains continued through the autumn of 2023. revealing additional details about his final moments that helped investigators reconstruct what had likely occurred in December 1960. The skull damage was determined to be consistent with gunshot wounds rather than blunt force trauma. Specifically, at least 2 shots fired from behind at close range using a large-caliber handgun. The trajectory indicated that Marcelo had been seated in the back seat of his Impala when shot, possibly having been ordered there by captors who intended to execute him before concealing both body and vehicle. This suggested a planned operation rather than an impulsive killing, supporting theories of organizational sanction. Additional evidence recovered from the Impala provided further insights into Marcello's final hours and the identity of those who might have been involved in his death. The gold lighter found in the vehicle was engraved with the initials SMM, confirming it had belonged to Marcelo himself. The wallet contained identification cards, a photograph of his children, and nearly $300 in cash that his killers had apparently not bothered to take. A ring of keys found on the floor included not only car and house keys but also keys to the construction company office and what appeared to be a safe deposit box, the location of which investigators would never be able to determine. The absence of the vehicle's license plates indicated deliberate effort to complicate identification, though the killers had apparently not considered that the VIN would provide an alternative pathway to establishing ownership. This oversight suggested either haste in executing the disposal plan or confidence that the vehicle would never be discovered. Given the sophistication of the concealment operation, the latter explanation seemed more probable. Someone had calculated that the hidden chamber would remain undiscovered indefinitely, and for 63 years that calculation had proven correct. Only the condemned building's eventual demolition had exposed the secret that patient planning had concealed. Historical analysis of the warehouse's ownership during 1960 revealed connections that strengthened the case for organizational involvement in Marcelo's death. The Consolidated Storage and Transfer Company had been controlled at that time by men with documented ties to the Savella family, providing access to the building and the expertise necessary to construct the hidden chamber. Construction records from the period showed that minor renovation work had been performed in the sub-basement during December 1960. Officially described as repairs to the drainage system. This work would have provided cover for the construction of the brick partition that sealed Marcelo's tomb. The FBI investigation into Marcelo's death, reopened following the discovery of his remains, could identify probable perpetrators, but could not pursue prosecution given the passage of time. Nick Savella had died in 1983, never facing charges for the killing despite his probable role in ordering it. His brother Carl had died in 1994, and most other members of the organization from that era had similarly passed away before the truth emerged from the demolished warehouse. The men who had walled Marcelo into his tomb had themselves gone to their graves, taking with them specific knowledge of the operation that could never be recovered. The investigation, nevertheless, documented the probable sequence of events with reasonable confidence based on available evidence. Marcelo had likely been summoned to a meeting at the warehouse on the evening of December 14, 1960, possibly under the pretense of discussing a construction project or organizational business. Upon arrival, he had been directed to enter his Impala's back seat, perhaps told that he would be transported to the actual meeting location. Instead, he had been shot twice in the back of the head by an individual standing outside the driver's side window. The body was then driven into the pre-prepared chamber, the Impala positioned carefully, and the brick partition constructed to seal the space forever. The motive for Marcello's execution remained uncertain despite extensive investigation, though several credible theories emerged from the analysis of FBI files and informant reports from the period. The most compelling theory suggested that Marcelo had been perceived as a potential informant following federal pressure on the organization in late 1960. Several members of his crew had been arrested on gambling charges that autumn, and at least one had reportedly been offered leniency in exchange for testimony. Whether Marcello himself had been approached by federal agents was never established, but suspicion alone could have been sufficient to warrant his elimination in the paranoid atmosphere that prevailed. Alternative theories proposed that Marcello's death was connected to financial irregularities in the gambling operations he supervised, or to his knowledge of activities that the organization's leadership preferred to keep concealed. The timing of his death, shortly after the Savella brothers were added to Nevada's Black Book, suggested possible connection to the organization's Las Vegas interests. If Marcello had possessed information about casino skimming operations that were then being established, his potential value as a witness would have made his continued existence a significant risk. Whatever the specific cause, his death fit a pattern of organizational discipline that characterized the Savella family's operations. The announcement of Marcello's identification brought closure to his surviving children, who had lived for more than 6 decades without knowing their father's fate. Michael, now in his mid-70s, traveled from Chicago to view the recovered remains and provide DNA samples that confirmed the identification beyond any doubt. Rosa accompanied him, the siblings united for the first time in years by the resolution of a mystery that had shaped their entire lives. Vincent had died in February 2024, just months before the final confirmation, never receiving the answers he had sought through decades of struggle with addiction and emotional trauma. The funeral mass for Salvatore Marcello was held on March 15, 2024, at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church, the same parish where he had married Angela Fontana 76 years earlier. The service was attended by approximately 40 family members and a handful of curious observers, the congregation far smaller than the crowd that had celebrated his wedding in 1948. Father Thomas Benedetti, who had researched the family's history before the service, offered words of comfort that acknowledged both the tragedy of Marcello's death and the complexity of his life. The eulogy made no mention of his criminal associations, focusing instead on his roles as husband, father, and member of a community that had long since been transformed beyond recognition. Marcello was buried beside his wife Angela in Mount Olivet Cemetery, reunited in death with the woman who had waited 31 years without knowing his fate. The headstone that marked their graves bore only their names and dates, no epitaph attempting to summarize lives that had been shaped by forces beyond simple description. Michael and Rosa stood together at the graveside, their faces revealing emotions that words could not adequately express. They had finally received the closure their mother never experienced, though the answers they obtained raised as many questions as they resolved about the life their father had lived and the death he had suffered. The 1,960 Chevrolet Impala that had served as Marcello's tomb was transported to a restoration facility for assessment, though the vehicle's historical significance exceeded any potential mechanical value. The car had been remarkably well preserved by the sealed environment that had protected it from moisture, temperature fluctuation, and the other factors that normally degraded abandoned vehicles. Experts estimated that with extensive work, the Impala could potentially be restored to operational condition, though such restoration would inevitably destroy evidence of the crime it had witnessed. The decision was made to preserve the vehicle in its discovered state as a historical artifact, eventually to be displayed at a museum dedicated to Kansas City's complex history. The West Bottoms district continued its gradual transformation following the discovery, with the warehouse site eventually cleared for a mixed-use development project that would bring new residents and businesses to the historic neighborhood. The developers acknowledged the site's grim history, but argued that renewal was preferable to allowing the past to prevent progress. A small memorial would be incorporated into the development's design, honoring not Marcello specifically, but the many individuals whose fates remained unknown. Buried beneath the industrial landscape that had once defined this corner of Kansas City, the Savella crime family that had ordered Marcello's death continued to operate for decades after his burial in the hidden chamber, though its power gradually diminished as federal prosecution and changing social conditions eroded its foundations. Nick Savella's conviction on gambling charges in 1977 marked the beginning of the organization's decline, and subsequent prosecutions related to Las Vegas casino skimming effectively destroyed its leadership during the 1,980 seconds. The family remained nominally active into the 21st century, but its influence had become minimal compared to the power it had wielded during Marcello's era. The world that had produced both the crime and its concealment had largely ceased to exist. The investigation concluded that Salvatore Marcello had been murdered on or about December 14, 1000. 960, by person or persons unknown acting on behalf of the Kansas City organized crime family headed by Nick Savella. The perpetrators had concealed his body and vehicle in a hidden chamber beneath a warehouse they controlled, sealing the space with a brick partition and removing documentary evidence of its existence. The crime had remained undiscovered for 63 years, until demolition of the warehouse exposed the hidden chamber to investigators. All known suspects in the case were deceased, making prosecution impossible regardless of the evidence accumulated. The story of Salvatore Marcello serves as a reminder that the crimes of the past are never truly buried, only hidden until circumstances conspire to reveal them. The men who sealed him in that underground chamber believed they had constructed a tomb that would preserve their secret forever. For more than 6 decades, their confidence appeared justified. But buildings eventually fall, walls eventually crumble, and secrets eventually surface. The city that had been built on the labor of immigrants and the profits of industry had also been built on violence that remained concealed beneath its foundations. The discovery of Marcello's remains exposed one such secret, leaving open the question of how many others might still wait in the darkness. The West Bottoms neighborhood where Marcello met his end had transformed beyond recognition during the decades of his concealment. The meatpacking plants that had once employed thousands were long since closed, their buildings converted to antique markets and event venues that attracted visitors seeking atmosphere rather than employment. The livestock exchange building still stood, a monument to an industry that had moved on, its grand architecture now serving purposes its builders never imagined. The workers who had given the neighborhood its character were gone, replaced by tourists and artists drawn to spaces that history had abandoned. Kansas City itself had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to Salvatore Marcello in 1960. The city had grown outward into suburban sprawl that extended for miles beyond its original boundaries. The downtown that had been the center of commerce and crime alike had declined and revived and declined again, each cycle leaving its mark on the urban landscape. The political machines that had protected organized crime had been dismantled, replaced by structures more resistant to corruption, if not entirely immune. The world Marcello had known existed now only in archives and memories that grew fewer each year. For 63 years, Salvatore Marcello had waited in the darkness beneath a city that had forgotten him. His wife had mourned without closure. His children had grown old without answers. His killers had prospered and eventually died, never facing justice for the crime they had committed. But the darkness could not last forever. Eventually, a demolition crew broke through a hidden wall, and the secret that powerful men had worked so hard to conceal was finally exposed to the light. The discovery could not undo the wrong that had been done, but it could at least ensure that the truth was finally known. The forensic reconstruction of Marcello's final moments drew upon physical evidence, historical context, and the accumulated expertise of investigators who had studied organized crime violence across multiple decades. The precision of the execution, the sophistication of the concealment, and the seamless transition of his responsibilities within the organization all pointed to a planned operation authorized at the highest levels. Nick Savella had built his reputation on discipline and discretion, qualities that the Marcello killing exemplified, even as it demonstrated the organization's capacity for ruthless elimination of perceived threats. The men who carried out the execution had done their work professionally, leaving no witnesses and constructing a tomb that defied discovery for more than 6 decades. The construction of the brick partition that sealed Marcello's chamber had required specific skills and materials that helped investigators narrow the list of potential participants. The mortar composition was consistent with commercial supplies available in Kansas City during 1960, and the brickwork showed professional technique that suggested experience in masonry trades. Several members of the Savella organization were known to have backgrounds in construction, including men who worked for legitimate companies that could have provided both materials and cover for the concealment operation. The work had been completed within a matter of days, probably during nights when the warehouse was unoccupied by legitimate workers. The removal of architectural drawings from city records represented a separate but equally important element of the concealment strategy. Someone with access to the building department's files had identified and removed documents that showed the sub-basement's full extent, including the chamber where Marcello would be entombed. This required either corruption of city employees or sophisticated theft that went undetected for decades. The Savella organization was known to have cultivated relationships with municipal officials throughout Kansas City, relationships that facilitated their operations and protected them from interference. The removal of the drawings was simply another manifestation of this institutional corruption. The Impala's condition, after 63 years of concealment, provided forensic specialists with unusual opportunities for evidence preservation. The sealed environment had prevented the oxidation that normally degraded fingerprints and other trace evidence, theoretically allowing recovery of identifying information from surfaces that would have been useless under normal circumstances. However, the dust accumulation and the disturbance caused by the initial discovery had compromised many potential evidence locations. Technicians did recover partial fingerprints from the steering wheel and door handles, but these could not be matched to any individual in available databases, as the probable perpetrators had never been fingerprinted or had died before comprehensive digital records were established. Ballistic analysis of the projectiles recovered from Marcello's skull identified them as .45 caliber rounds, consistent with ammunition used in the Colt Model 1911 pistol, a weapon favored by organized crime figures during the mid-20th century. The bullets had fragmented upon impact, making precise ballistic matching impossible, but their caliber and construction were consistent with factory loads available during 1960. The weapon itself was never recovered, likely having been disposed of separately from the body to prevent any connection between the gun and the crime. This represented standard organized crime practice during the era, separating elements of evidence to complicate any investigation that might eventually occur. The chamber's construction had inadvertently created conditions that preserved not only the body and vehicle but also organic evidence that would normally have decomposed within years. Samples of material found in the Impala's interior included degraded biological matter that DNA analysis could potentially link to individuals present at the time of the killing. However, the technology necessary for such analysis had not existed in 1960, and the degradation of the samples over 63 years had reduced their evidentiary value significantly. Investigators extracted what information they could, but the results were inconclusive and could not definitively identify anyone other than Marcello himself. The psychological impact of Marcello's disappearance on his family had extended across 3 generations, shaping lives in ways that the killers could never have anticipated or intended. His son Michael had devoted his legal career to representing legitimate businesses, explicitly rejecting any connection to the criminal enterprises that had defined his father's life. His daughter Rosa had married a man whose family had no connection to Kansas City's Italian-American community, moving in social circles that knew nothing of her origins. His son Vincent had never escaped the shadow of his father's disappearance, self-medicating with alcohol and drugs in a futile attempt to fill the void left by unanswered questions. The discovery came too late to help Vincent, who died without experiencing the closure his siblings finally received. The Kansas City Police Department formally closed the Marcello case in April 2024. Acknowledging that while the circumstances of his death had been substantially determined, prosecution was impossible due to the passage of time and the death of all potential defendants. The closing report, running to nearly 300 pages, documented the investigation's findings and preserved them for historical purposes. The report concluded that Marcello had been murdered by members of the Kansas City organized crime family, acting on orders from leadership, that his body and vehicle had been concealed in a specifically constructed hidden chamber, and that the crime had remained undetected for 63 years until the warehouse's demolition exposed the evidence. Historical analysis of the Savella organization's methods during the 1,960 seconds revealed that the Marcello killing fit a pattern of disciplinary eliminations that characterized the family's approach to internal threats. Unlike more flamboyant organizations in other cities, the Kansas City family preferred quiet disappearances to public violence, understanding that missing persons attracted less law enforcement attention than bodies found in public places. Several other disappearances from the same era remained unsolved, their victims presumably concealed with similar care in locations that had not yet been discovered. The Marcello case suggested that beneath Kansas City's surface, other secrets might still wait in darkness. The discovery prompted renewed examination of cold case files from the 1950 and 1960 as investigators sought to identify other potential victims whose fates might be connected to organized crime activity. Several missing persons cases from that era shared characteristics with the Marcello disappearance: sudden vanishing without explanation, connections to the Italian-American community, and family members who reported receiving subtle warnings against pursuing inquiries. Whether any of these individuals might also be concealed beneath Kansas City's industrial landscape could not be determined without comprehensive surveying that would be prohibitively expensive and disruptive. The West Bottoms redevelopment that had necessitated the warehouse's demolition continued despite the discovery, with developers acknowledging the site's history while arguing that the neighborhood's future should not be held hostage to its past. The planned mixed-use development would bring hundreds of new residents to an area that had been largely depopulated since the meatpacking industry's decline. A small memorial plaza would acknowledge the site's significance, honoring those whose fates remained unknown alongside the one whose story had finally been told. The design deliberately avoided sensationalism, presenting the history as tragedy rather than entertainment. The museum that would eventually display Marcello's Impala planned an exhibit contextualizing the vehicle within the broader history of organized crime in Kansas City. The exhibit would trace the development of criminal organizations from the Pendergast era through the Savella family's rise and eventual decline, using the preserved automobile as a tangible connection to events that had shaped the city's development. Curators emphasized that the display would not glorify criminal activity, but rather illuminate a chapter of history that remained poorly understood by most Kansas City residents. The vehicle's condition, frozen at the moment of its concealment, would serve as a stark reminder of the violence that had accompanied the city's growth. The families of other missing persons from the same era watched the Marcello case with mixed emotions, hoping that their own loved ones might someday be found, while recognizing that most secrets from that period would never be revealed. Support groups formed to connect survivors of organized crime violence, providing community for individuals who had long felt isolated by their families' unusual histories. The discovery had demonstrated that answers were sometimes possible even after decades of silence, offering hope to those who had given up expecting resolution. But it had also demonstrated how thoroughly evidence could be concealed when powerful organizations committed to ensuring that truth remained buried. The transformation of Kansas City's organized crime landscape over the decades since Marcello's death reflected broader changes in American criminal enterprise. The traditional Italian-American families that had dominated urban crime during the mid-20th century had largely been supplanted by newer organizations with different structures and different methods. The Savella family persisted in diminished form, its members scattered, and its influence minimal compared to its historical peak. The discipline and discretion that had characterized the organization during its height had given way to less sophisticated operations that attracted more law enforcement attention. The era that had produced Salvatore Marcello and his killers had passed into history. The final report on the Marcello investigation acknowledged the limitations of historical justice while affirming the value of truth, regardless of its practical consequences. The men who killed Salvatore Marcello had escaped earthly punishment, living out their lives without facing accountability for the violence they had committed. But the discovery of his remains had achieved something that punishment could not. It had restored his story to history, acknowledging his existence and his fate after decades of deliberate erasure. His family could finally mourn properly, and his community could finally reckon with the violence that had shaped its development. Truth, even delayed truth, carried value that transcended the impossible pursuit of justice. 63 years is a long time for truth to remain entombed. Children were born, grew old, and died during the decades that Salvatore Marcello lay in his sealed chamber beneath the West Bottoms warehouse. The Cold War intensified and ended. Men walked on the moon. The internet transformed human communication. Kansas City's skyline grew unrecognizable. Its stockyards closed, its neighborhoods transformed. Through all of it, Marcello remained in his Impala, preserved in darkness that seemed absolute, until a demolition crew broke through the brick partition and let light enter for the first time in more than 6 decades. The discovery was not justice in any meaningful sense, coming too late to punish the guilty or comfort those who had grieved longest. But it was truth, finally, after generations of silence. Rest in peace, Salvatore Marcello. Your long wait in the darkness is finally over. After 63 years entombed beneath the city where you lived and died, you have been brought back into the light. The Impala that carried you to your death has become a museum piece, a relic of an era when men like you lived and died by rules that seem almost incomprehensible today. Your wife went to her grave not knowing what happened to you, but your children finally have answers to questions that shadowed their entire lives. The men who killed you are beyond earthly justice now, but your story has been told at last, and you are finally at rest. Reunited with Angela in the cemetery where your family waited decades for your return, your fate known, your memory preserved in the history of a city that never stopped building, even over the bodies of its dead.